Welcome, everybody. Today, our topic will be outer space policy, and our speaker is Cullen Davis. I will introduce him in a second, but first I will say that this event is sponsored by the American Association of University Women, the Tyler Smith County branch of the League of Women Voters, and the Foreign Policy Association, which is responsible for the topics we have every year, and we have been putting these on here for over the past 3 decades. Now, our speaker today is Cullen Davis. Cullen Davis is a professor of economics at Tyler Junior College, right down the road there. Mr. Davis has a background as a Chinese Mandarin linguist with the Air Force from 2011 to 2017. During his tour, he held the position of Target Senior Analyst at the National Security Agency, Hawaii, where he directed scores of service members in target research and analysis. As a senior analyst, Mr. Davis was responsible for leadership briefing and interagency coordination in support of top intelligence priorities. In this position, his work has been influential to strategic decision making, and he has briefed to the highest levels in the U.S. government. And with that, I present you our esteemed speaker, Professor Cullen Davis. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. It's a little bit different for me. I haven't really been in this kind of environment for this sort of topic in a while, so it's certainly nice to kind of get back to it. All that to be. Today we're getting into the outer space policy section of this great discussions program that goes on here. And please forgive me if I've misspelled anything in these slides. So first off, we'll do a little bit on the background of the beginnings of spacefaring. So in the 1950s, we had the launch of Sputnik 1, a model of which is presented here, and the creation of NASA. Obviously, this kind of kicked off the space race, right, where some of us here may remember the time whenever there was a new, essentially manipulated domain that existed, right? We suddenly started kind of reaching toward the heavens with the first artificial satellite that was put into space there. The U.S. obviously quickly needed to decided they needed to catch up, right? And so we implemented NASA, and we brought in at the end of World War II, obviously we brought in a lot of talent for working on rockets, particularly for this goal of putting stuff into space, right? Verner Von Braun, who may or may not have heard of him, his entire goal, even whenever he was working with the Nazis, was really to put something into outer space. He didn't care too much for the military use of the rockets at the time. And so after that, into the 60s, we had originally the first living organism to get put into space was Laika. Did not survive, but Belka and Strelka were among the first groups of living organisms that did. There were 2 dogs also who went into space and safely returned. Thus, kind of proof of concept here of we can put eventually people into space and eventually get them back. And then not too long after that, Yuri Gagarin went into space, came back, being the first man into space, all from the USSR. During this time, the US and Russia both were implementing ISR satellites, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites, mostly on imagery and what we call ELINT, which is essentially just collecting electronic signals coming into space. And that was the majority of our work there. We were still working on manned space. We got manned space crewed flights with multiple people going into space, eventually people going into space and being able to not have to stay in a spacesuit, right? They were able to eventually, loiter in space without having to be, constantly protected. They were able to pressurize with oxygen. And we also, during this time, implemented the Outer Space Treaty, which committed the US and the USSR, as well as some other countries, towards not putting essentially kinetic weapons into outer space. We'll talk about later how pretty much all of outer space is weaponized in some way, but the Outer Space Treaty was to avoid kinetic weapons in outer space. And then by the end of the 60s, roughly 11 years after the first satellite was launched, we put a man on the moon, right? And so that progression is incredibly quick that we get through. And then into the 1970s, we start getting some more cooperation in space. We get the Apollo Soyuz trials, where the US and the USSR started working together to eventually what would become the International Space Station. And we started putting up probably one of the most important things to come out of space with GPS. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's important also. So through the 80s and into the 2000s, we get this popularization of space. A lot of it deals with a change of focus in space. We focus less on manned space flight and start looking more at putting up satellites. Right? We want to put up satellites that do different tasks. During this time period, I mean, apart from to the International Space Station, manned flights don't happen a whole lot in the US especially. And then we get the first Gulf War in the early 90s. And the first Gulf War was a real turning point in space for the fact of it was a proof case, I guess you could say, of the effectiveness of space tools in warfare. Particularly, if we remember all the reporting out of the first Gulf War, we and the liberation of Kuwait, essentially it was a bunch of Iraqis trying to find reverse in a Russian tank, right? They did not do well against US forces, and a lot of that had to do with our implementation, particularly of GPS. And actually what you see here is a soldier using an early GPS terminal for themselves to locate where they are and then where they need to go. This is particularly useful in the desert for the fact if you don't get a lot of landmarks. And while we were there, you even saw that the Iraqis noticed how important our GPS was, and they started implementing different types of counter space measures, particularly jamming around important outposts or important facilities for the Iraqi government. And then we get the entry of Western Europe and Asia much more into space. Western Europe, you get pretty much the Eurozone. And Asia, we had Japan. This is the beginning of Chinese space travel, and India being the three major players out of Asia for space travel then. And then also over this time, we get a lot more commercial expansion. A lot of the old imagery satellites, especially in GPS and stuff like that had gone up before, that were explicitly military use, now became commercial use. Right? Google Maps, pretty much the ability to look at pictures on Google Maps, right, from space were based largely on old NRO, our National Reconnaissance Office satellites that were repurposed for Google. And so you get a huge expansion of space. And then eventually too, you'll start getting into space-based internet services and other things like that, right? If anybody's used a satellite phone, I don't know, there are several constellations of satellite phones that also went up during this time, Iridium and Inmarsat, those sorts. And so, which all have a lot of applications more than just military, although they're kind of dual use, as we'll talk about those too. All right, so the Chinese space program, this is kind of where my wheelhouse is a little bit. Here we've got a picture of Wanhu from the Marshall Space Center. And Wanhu is an apocryphal story of the beginnings of Chinese spaceflight. May or may not have actually existed. The timeline is very uncertain here. Some say as far back as 2000 BC, which would put it about 3,000 years before gunpowder, so that's probably not likely. But the idea is he straps a bunch of gunpowder-powered rockets to a chair and flies into space. If he did exist, chances are, and he did try this, chances are he probably just kind of, burnt up pretty quickly. But it's an interesting story. Like all Chinese apocryphal stories, there's maybe it's probably based on some sort of truth, but probably not too likely. But in earnest, the Chinese space program really starts in 1958 with Project 581. This is right after the USSR launched Sputnik, and China and the USSR didn't always have like the best relationships, but they decided, hey, essentially Mao said in 1958, we also need to develop man-made satellites, and so the Chinese Academy of Sciences put forward this Project 581, and then it was launching. They were trying to launch satellites, right? It was mostly a lot of rocket development. They got a very few amount of satellites over time until 1993, whenever the Chinese National Space Administration was created. Before this, all of their space exploration had been pretty much under the purview of the Second Artillery Forces, which is essentially they do rockets, right? Kind of like a portion of our stratcom, I guess. But that was so they moved it to a civilian sphere, and they ended up being able to acquire a lot more external help whenever it was, for almost explicitly for the purpose of it not being a military program, so they could get more international development with that. And so from 2000 to 2020, they started putting up the Beidou navigation satellites, which are a competitor to GPS. So 2000, the first one went up, 2020, the last one went up. And it has fairly large coverage, and that coverage becomes more complete with their cooperation recently with the Russians, which we'll talk about later also. And then 2003, they had their first human in space. So became the first developing country to put a human into space. So that was interesting. And 2020, they had the Tianwen-1, which was the Mars mission. And they become the third country to have a soft landing on Mars. So once again, their development was incredibly quick, going from, essentially few satellites a year in up to 2020, or up until 2000, and then by 2003 they have a person in space, and then by 2020 they have a rover soft landed on Mars, and then in 2021 they started the Tiangong space station. So now they've got a crewed manned vehicle orbiting space in which they do experiments, and same thing we do with the International Space Station. And so within 21 years they went from very basic to incredibly advanced on their space front. Now, of course, this is also 50 years now, I guess, after we put a man on the moon. So it was there was some benefit there of not being the first ones into it. That does help accelerate your development process, but it's still pretty impressive nonetheless. And so whenever it comes to space, China puts out a series of what they call white papers, and they range from a lot of different topics. They have one specifically for space, but I think the excerpt from their military white paper is probably more telling of their actual space goals. And essentially they say, outer space has become a commanding height in international strategic competition. Countries concerned are developing their space forces and instruments, and the first signs of weaponization of outer space have appeared. China has all along advocated the peaceful use of outer space, opposed the weaponization of an arms race in outer space, and taken an active part in international space cooperation. So they start off with, well, there's a lot of people in space. It's kind of risky, but we are dedicated to the peaceful use. But then they say, China will keep abreast of the dynamics of outer space, deal with security threats and challenges in that domain, and secure its space assets to serve its national economic and social development and maintain outer space security. So essentially the whole statement, if taken together, right, is that, well, we're not going to do that unless we have to. And it looks like we have to. So, it is how it is. But we then lead into some conflict in space, and I messed up my, here. And so starting off, the military domain of space is that, essentially space exploration has always been a military effort. It started as a military effort, it always has been. An interesting, I guess, kind of event that happened in the 20th century is that up until the 20th century, most of the things used in war were previously tools, right? So tools became weapons, essentially, up until about the 20th century. But then after the 20th century, especially with space and then later the internet and other types of development that we got, it was weapons that became tools, right? And so space has pretty much always been a military domain. Up until very recently, we did not have any sort of like commercial organizations vying for space, right? All of space was pretty much done off of the government dime, right, in order to make weapons. In particular, ISR satellites, one of the biggest things, partially because of the space treaty, right, of we're not going to make kinetic weapons in space. So then the other option there for using space as a military domain is to be able to gain better knowledge, right? And we saw something similar too with just air, right? The first use of airplanes in war was the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, where we were using airplanes to essentially perform reconnaissance on enemy forces during that war. And then later they realized you could drop bombs from them. And then after that they realized that if there's other planes in the area, you could take a gun and shoot at the other guy. And so, then eventually we get the advanced aircraft we have today. But originally it started off just a guy flying over and looking at where people were, right? And so it's kind of like ISR is super important, and this is one of the things that we certainly learned during the first Gulf War, and it's certainly a lesson that China has also learned, that ISR is incredibly important. A lot of it comes out of these dual-use technologies. The navigation, right? If you know where you're going and how to get there, makes it a lot easier to fight wars. Communication, pretty clear also. If you can communicate with your leadership, if you communicate with other forces, other friendlies, it's better. It's easier to coordinate your actions and provide on-time delivery. And then meteorology, like everywhere else, knowing what your weather conditions are going to be is also incredibly important. And so this has led to a lot of counter space, especially out of China, counter space kind of technologies. So the non-kinetic counter space technologies are the ones that we're generally okay with as far as not being in violation of this outer space treaty. This idea of like jammers, just something to prevent an enemy from either being able to find you with their GPS systems or be able to use their GPS systems or other types of diversion that you can implement for against satellites. And then directed energy weapons, if you hear about like dazzling and stuff like that, it's generally this idea of we're going to push a bunch of signal towards a satellite and try to break its receiver. It's kind of the idea. And then on the other hand, we have kinetic, which becomes a lot more concerning. With the direct ascent anti-satellite missiles, that's the direct ascent ASAT. China launched one of these in 2013, and I think 2014 also. Where they, if you saw the news story of they shot a missile in the sky and then blew up a old weather satellite. I think it was a weather satellite. And then it created a whole bunch of, dust in the air in orbit. And it's been a big concern about space debris, right? People have been very concerned about. This isn't the first time that it's happened. We've destroyed several of those, several of old satellites like that. One that I thought was really cool was that after the Chinese direct ASAT went up and shot down the aircraft, we from the USS Lake Erie, where we things floating on the ocean, right? And then from this boat, we fire up a missile and shoot a satellite out of space. And I guess the important part there is that we've demonstrated that our ability to launch these kind of anti-satellite or counter space weapons doesn't depend on being somewhere, right? And so that's kind of an interesting little bit there. And then the other big concern is the co-orbital satellite weapon systems. And this would be essentially you put up another so you've got some enemy satellite here, right? You put up another satellite that kind of just follows it. And then whenever you want to destroy the satellite, you can run into it, or some of them got little arms that they can use to pull it out of orbit, or they've talked about putting machine guns on them, right? All sorts of different things you could do, but essentially it's putting up another satellite that would go around and destroy potentially other satellites. And so counterspace is incredibly important for China. They want to certainly develop a lot more of these type of capabilities because they do see that the U.S., the belief is certainly that the U.S.'s greatest strength is the ability to basically control space, right? That we have the assets available in the air, and that we can maintain those assets over time, and that's what's going to be the defining factor of the U.S. being able to prosecute war against China, right? So if any sort of conflict with China situation, that would be certainly the first thing we would expect to happen, is that they're going to be trying to take down U.S. satellites, right? And it's a bit of a two-edged sword, though, right? Because a lot of the things to try to take down enemy satellites, they do create things like debris fields and stuff like that, which might also end up taking down your own satellites. As well as if you have a highly contested electromagnetic spectrum, right? And so you've got a lot of jammers out there, it becomes difficult to even use your own. As well as the fact that putting up jammers makes you a target, right? Because you're putting out a lot of signal, and that's something that can be found pretty easily. And so there's also this kind of question of, is China, if in the event of a U.S.-China conflict, is China going to be willing to essentially fight in the dark, right? Would they be willing to just totally wipe out the electromagnetic spectrum in space in order to not allow the U.S. that advantage? And so it's certainly something to be looking forward to. Or not looking forward to, but looking, yeah, maybe. Certainly something to be cognizant of as things go. Additionally, what we've seen in space is a lot of coalition forming. In 2011, we had the Wolf Amendment, which prevented the U.S. from engaging with China in a lot of space policy. There are some carve-outs, right? Like if a program is vetted by the FBI and what have you, it can still engage. NASA specifically can engage with China on space exploration. The problem here has been, as you've probably seen in a lot of technology-related fields, that China is not opposed to stealing, essentially copying technologies that they acquire through any sort of either through purchase or cooperation and that what have you. For a long time, right, Russia wouldn't sell China any aircraft carriers, right? And eventually Ukraine did sell them one because they knew that if China bought an aircraft carrier, they'd be able to copy it. And so, and Russia and China have always been kind of at odds. But even though they have been at odds, there has been some Sino-Russian cooperation, especially with Beidou and GLONASS. And these are the respective countries, their radio navigation, GPS type of technologies. And this allows them to essentially have worldwide coverage between the two countries and provide essentially a feasible competitor to the GPS Galileo constellations. This certainly serves two purposes. Probably the primary one is in the realm of commercial use, because they want to compete with Europe and the US in the commercial realm. One, because it makes them money, but then two, because it makes friends, right? And especially with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is actively engaging many countries through essentially kind of an economic diplomacy. And this gives them something else to kind of tie into, it gives countries another way to buy into the Chinese system, if that makes sense. And then additionally, if it from the military standpoint, it probably is more a signal than it is an actual, they're going to be using this in any sort of real capacity. And largely because, well, this is a little bit of my opinion here, right? I'll give you a little bit of my opinion. I'm not super sold on the idea that China and Russia will ever be best friends. I don't think that they will ever really have a good chance of actually coming together to fight a war, largely because the Chinese-Russian exchange is generally China provides economic resources for Russia, Russia provides military resources for China. But I personally, right, I'm fairly confident that if either one of those countries becomes too strong in the benefit that they're receiving, so if Russia's economy becomes too strong, or if China's military becomes too strong, that the other party is going to break off that engagement, because then they become too much of a competitor, if that makes sense. And which is pretty much the pattern that we've seen between Russia and China for the last, at least since 1949, right? Yeah, but on top of that, they've also talked about, and I guess came to an agreement on the moon base, where they're going to attempt to set up a facility on the moon. The moon's an interesting strategic position. One, for it's beneficial in that it's hard to get to, and so it's hard for opponents to mess with anything you have out there. On the other hand, it only comes around once a day, right? And so you do get somewhat worldwide coverage from it, but unlike a satellite, you can't move it, right? Hopefully, not yet. I'm concerned about whenever they do decide to try to move it. But so it's an interesting kind of piece there. And this is, I mean, once again, it's purely the kind of cooperation where these two have a common enemy, right, in the West. And so they want to make this appearance of, we are strong here and we can counter you if you try to do anything towards us, right? And so, but you do see a lot of this correlation forming. And then obviously the US has had Western partners for a long time, especially in Europe. And then one of the last big hallmarks, I guess, that we'll talk about here for the conflicts in space is the military reorganization. So China went from having pretty much all of their their space program within it went from Second Artillery to the Chinese National Space Association. I always forget the name of it. Their civilian version of it, and then they brought space kind of back into the fold of the military. Although the civilian organization still exists, they made a dedicated, well, somewhat dedicated. The Strategic Support Force provides a lot of the space, cyberspace, and electronic warfare. These all kind of go together. A lot of it's information oriented. And this was to essentially kind of counter the somewhat fragmented nature of the US version of this for a long time, because the Air Force had a big portion of space in cyberspace, but then so did the Navy, and the Army had their own thing. And then we had NSACSS, which was doing its own thing. And so it was a little bit fragmented there. And then China kind of realized whenever they were doing their larger reorganization from military districts to the military regions, and then kind of standing up new forces, they brought in the Strategic Support Force to kind of join the important parts of information together, that is space, cyberspace, and electronic warfare. And then eventually the US said, hey, we probably should do something about the fragmented nature of our space programs here. And so they brought it together inside the Space Force, which largely drew from the Air Force, but then also bringing in a lot of the Navy. And I think too, if you remember, the earliest astronauts, they were all from multiple services, right? Mostly Air Force and the Navy, but that kind of speaks to how fragmented our space program was, our military space program was, and has been since then, until recently when we kind of decided to put them all together. So this kind of also points to how important space is as a domain towards future warfighting. All right. And then, so some of the goals of space policy going forward. Obviously, in the military, we want to create advantage, right? We want to be able to see more of our enemy, direct more of our forces, and then we also want to protect those advantages, right? So at some point, we're going to have to get into deciding how we deal with counter space technologies. Specifically, the non-kinetic counter space can generally be done with some software updates, right, over time. Some of them require hardening sensors and that sort of event, but it's really the kinetic ones that will become incredibly risky for us, especially with direct descent. And I think the co-orbital ones, probably the co-orbital satellites, are really going to be the dangerous part there. So how do we defend against co-orbital satellites? And it's difficult to do within the bounds of our outer space treaty that we have signed, right? Because, essentially, it's very clearly weaponizing space, even though space has pretty much been weaponized from the beginning. But also, we need to we'll need to be thinking about how we're going to deny enemy capabilities going into the future, because, like I said, everybody learned a lesson from the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and everybody learned just how important it was to have, satellites that were able to, do wayfinding and were able to pick up, enemy signals, and were able to help you determine what the weather's going to be, right? And so, just as much as that has been an advantage for us, right? We've lost the first one there advantage, right? We've lost the advantage of being a first mover in that case. And other countries are rapidly catching up in areas where they're not caught up yet, and there are plenty of areas where they are caught up. And so we'll need to be certainly looking forward to how we're going to deny these capabilities in the future. And some of this has already been kind of done, well, backing up a little bit to the protecting advantages, some of it's been done by divesting from space a little bit. If anybody's familiar with like inertial guidance systems, where you kind of, you have to tell it where you started, and then basically it based on using kind of a gyroscope, and based on how you're moving, it tells you where you're at. So we've been working largely on a higher tech version of that, one that's more accurate, but still doesn't require satellites to do it, right? In case of this situation where China decides it's better to just fight in the dark, right, and completely deny everybody everywhere the advantages of outer space. So, it's fun times there. Going forward a little bit, on the economic side, for space, we want to make sure that systems that we do have up are reliable, right? Just recently, if you've heard about I think this is called Starlink, the space-based the satellite internet service that I think SpaceX is putting up. They had some 40 satellites or something like that fall out of the sky after a well, I don't know if they fell out of the sky, but they're no longer operating appropriately after a what was apparently a pretty mundane electromagnetical storm, right? And so that's something that we need to kind of keep on mind there. Interoperability. This is incredible. This is also especially important with whenever. Well, this is one of those areas where there's a lot to gain from having interoperable networks, much like Beidou and GLONASS, and then the GPS and Galileo systems, how they will communicate with each other. That gives you the ability to, one, form better bonds with other countries, and the more tied together you are, the less likely you are to try to kill each other, right? So that's a good thing. But then also it provides better advantages for your end user, right? Pretty much overnight, a Beidou user now suddenly has, significantly more coverage because Beidou and GLONASS decided to work together. And then, so that's certainly an important part. And then affordability, also, which is something that we've seen happening a lot, especially in the U.S. With our kind of burgeoning space companies, right? We've got SpaceX and Blue Origin, and there's actually a lot of people building rockets to send satellites to space. There are also a lot of companies that are building satellites. Something that used to cost you into what would be like billions of dollars today is now only in the millions. So, if we all work together in this room, we could probably put up a satellite if we really wanted to. But making it more affordable as we go will certainly help everyone who uses these services, right? I think probably the biggest boon for satellites in the economic realm is going to be from satellite internet services, for the fact of even around here, right? There are plenty of places where you can't get regular hardwire internet, right? And so being able to expand the reach, essentially the footprint of satellite services, and reduce those costs to where they're competitive, right? Because right now, I think the most basic of plans for satellite internet still around like $80 a month or something, which is kind of rough. But as those come down, that'll help connect more areas of rural people, right? And that'll certainly allow a lot more opportunities in that area. And then politically, we certainly want to use space to create alliances, right? We kind of do want people to depend on us, right? Because if they depend on us, they're less likely to attack us, right? And then, similarly, right, we also want to a little bit depend on some reliable neighbors. We don't necessarily want to depend on unreliable countries, but creating alliances is certainly an important part of space. And then obviously, too, we've still got the International Space Station up, even though some of that is kind of falling away. We're losing a few of those partners to China, which, that is what it is. Power projection is certainly another important part of space, especially with your expeditionary forces. Satellite communications and GPS, like we've talked about before, are incredibly important to having an expeditionary force. An expeditionary force being a force that is able to go out into the world, right, and essentially perform operations abroad rather than just on your shore, right? That's another big change for China recently, and I say recently, within the last 10 years, is that China previously was focused very much on being just a domestic defense, a homeland defense type of military. Hence, that's why they had their military districts set up the way they were, and that every district had everything inside of it. They were all supposed to be self-sufficient, that sort of thing. And then as they went on, they've moved towards trying to make a more expeditionary force. Recently, they started joining more UN missions. They sent blue helmets to parts of Africa. And they've been trying to work on this ability to be an expeditionary force. Satellites are going to be a very important part of that going forward. And then, most importantly, deterring threats through having essentially very strong resilient satellite systems, having a lot of redundancy, being able to show that we can lose 1 or 2 and that's fine, or we can lose 10 or 20 and that's fine. Being able to show that we can counter, especially non-kinetic, but also kinetic attacks on satellites going forward is going to be incredibly important for this not getting into a tight spot going forward. But that being that's about all I had for this, I guess, kind of quick run through space, if you will. And I believe now we'll open up the floor to questions. I've got one back here.
You didn't say anything about our satellites being able to talk to adversarial satellites so that we could piggyback on their capabilities.
You mean as far as like being able to join up, like kind of like Beto and GLONASS has, or like as far as spying on them?
Both. If Chinese has the technology up there that we don't, if we could communicate with their satellite without them knowing it, then we could piggyback on their technology. You haven't.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be reasonable that any government or any body that's flying satellites would want to have that capability. And so, it's certainly something that I would imagine somebody's working on if those specific capabilities aren't already available. How do we say this? For all intents and purposes, right? A signal is a signal, right? And if you've ever done like ham radio or anything like that, if you're in the vicinity of it, you can pick up the signal, right? And then it's just a matter of, can you decipher that signal? Can you demodulate really that signal and turn it into something usable for yourself? That is certainly an important capability that I would certainly believe that we need to be doing, because I would guarantee that anybody else is, right? So hopefully that doesn't, we can talk a little bit more later. Yeah.
I'm just curious, about how many satellites are there estimated to be up in space now?
Oh.
And how many of those are U.S. in terms of percentage. And I guess also, there's a lot of private companies put up satellites, as you mentioned. How big a portion of it is the private part of the satellite?
Well, there are thousands upon thousands of satellites. There's a lot of them. I couldn't give you specific numbers on them. The U.S. does have a huge chunk of those satellites, especially whenever you add in U.S. supported satellites. And we definitely launched, well, up until 2000, we certainly launched the lion's share of them. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I think right now I wouldn't be able to give you exact numbers on it, but we do have a lot of them, and of course we're certainly not the only country out there, right? Yeah, sorry, I don't have a better.
The satellites used for GPS, for example, are those owned by the government or by private companies?
I believe, well, they certainly were all previously owned by the government. I think they might still be, actually. That's another one I'm not super certain on, as far as all of them, right? Because it's a constellation that's a little bit changing here and there. But I believe they are all owned by the government. Yes?
Where does NASA fit in with this U.S. Space Force?
So NASA is the civilian branch of it, and so they both do and do not kind of fit in with the Space Force. Obviously, there's a lot of technology that'll be usable across both domains, but the Space Force is. So NASA is more concerned on exploration, whereas Space Force is more on intelligence. Really, is the big part of it. As far like on Earth, NASA's a little bit more looking out into the universe, right? And we certainly now we're kind of pivoting back towards more manned missions and putting people into space, and so that's going to be the thing, I believe.
How much does the European countries play in?
It's not a big part yet, but it is growing. I mean, it's still a lot of money, right? But as far as like relative power,
They rely on our technology?
There's a lot of reliance on U.S. technology. France in particular has become more, they've become more forward-looking. They're looking at how they can essentially send up more military-based satellite technologies. But for a large part, a lot of the European countries, especially like the NATO countries especially, depend on U.S. resources for that. And then it gets a little, I guess, vague between especially like the Five Eyes countries, right? So UK, US, Australia, Great Britain, and New Zealand, because we work together a lot with those. So a lot of them are kind of joint projects. So like, yes, they do have a part in it, but they're not alone necessarily. Does that make sense? But as far as like any independent, like if Europe didn't have the US, they would be in a bad spot, essentially is where we're getting to here. Does that make sense? Does that kind of get to it? Yeah.
When a commercial company, we're going to send a satellite into space, do they have permission to that with the U.S. government?
Yes. Yeah. There are a set of, I guess, what you would call, what's the word? Not formalities, but conventions. Sorry, a set of conventions of kind of registering your space flight. Even every time we set up a spy satellite, you see about it on the news. Yeah. It's an interesting kind of thing. It's kind of hard to hide a rocket launch.
When you register, I'm talking about the reason for it,
Yeah, they usually, there is a convention for that. Yeah.
guys and so forth.
Yeah, there is a convention for that, so that people know what's going up and where. I mean, not totally unlike how like the FTC or like the FAA handles both air flight and airwaves and signals. But you know, once you get past the rocket launch, though, you know, you could send sometimes, depending on what kind of payload you have, multiple satellites on one rocket, and so it may be not necessarily that we know what all is up there, if that makes sense. Because, you know, if somebody's, you know, they launch a satellite or they launch a rocket and they say, well, this satellite's on it, but then there's also this other satellite on it. I mean, you can't. There are ways to tell, certainly, but if I were an enterprising government, I would certainly try to launch satellites that aren't recognized, just to see if I could, right? So there's that, yeah.
I hear about all the junk in space.
Yes.
Debris. Is there a concern about that?
There is.
Is anyone working on figuring out what to do with it and how to clean it up?
Yes, there is a lot of concern about that, especially the more we have these you know, satellites go defunct and get destroyed, the more debris that ends up in outer space. Particularly, so most of the time you can destroy these satellites in a way that doesn't create that much debris. So like the test that we did off of the USS Lake Erie, that one was done essentially low enough in orbit so that whenever it exploded, it burnt up in the atmosphere. The problem with the Chinese launch around the 2010s is that it was high enough in orbit that all of that debris stayed in orbit. And so that's going to start, you know, running into other, you know, eventually some of those parts will start running into other satellites and cause damage and what have you. And so that is a very big concern. I'm certainly people a lot smarter than I am are working on it. I hope they are. I hope they're smarter than I am, because you know that's a big problem. And yeah, that probably, in all reality, that's probably going to end up, if that problem doesn't get fixed, that's going to be what makes space unoperable. Because I mean, if you can't fly satellites that don't get destroyed, it's yeah. Yeah.
Did you get your training in the Air Force for this?
I did. Yeah. A lot of, yep.
It's a separate branch of the Air Force?
No. So I was in the Air Force proper, and then I essentially just got farmed out to NSA for. My duty was stationed with them in that capacity. Yeah.
So do you see really realistically that people are ever going to live on other planets?
That is certainly a goal. I mean, a lot of the really future thinking work that comes out, especially for like the U.S. Air Force from the Air Academy, is pretty much assumes that people will be living on Mars. I don't know that I'll ever see it in my lifetime. That's quite a lofty goal, but you know that's it. I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility, and I know that it is certainly goals for people. Like there's certainly a lot of money going towards it, a lot of resources going towards it, and there can certainly be a significant benefit from doing it. So I certainly believe that over a long enough period of human existence, eventually, you know, we'll at least get out to Mars because it's pretty close. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your take on UFOs?
UFOs? Oh man. Well, they're unidentified, and you know and they fly, and yeah, they're objects of some sort. Yeah, I don't know. No, I haven't. seen one. I've been able to identify pretty much every flying object that I've seen in some manner. Yeah, it's I don't know. I don't.
Well, the Air Force has got to be looking at that
Yeah,
very seriously.
yeah. I wouldn't. I would assume that anything that I see flying in the sky came from Earth, right? That would be my assumption. That would be my first assumption every time. Just, because it's a long trip from anywhere else. So. But yeah, I don't know. It'd be neat. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
We have so many technological improvements and inventions and all that stuff that came out of the space race. Is that sort of thing still ongoing? I mean, are average people benefiting from some of this research?
I would say so. Certainly in the, certainly in the realm of things getting cheaper, right? That definitely helps a lot. For the fact of, we lose a lot less ships out on the ocean now, right? And, one, that's fewer people who die because of it, but then also that's cheaper goods to people because, they're able to get there. We're a lot more sure of where they are, right? And they're able to communicate well, and so we can coordinate essentially landings a lot better. And then I was talking about too, like with the satellite-based internet, that's certainly going to be a huge boon because laying cable is expensive, and especially out to some of the more remote areas, it's just unfeasible for a company to do that. And so that greater ability to communicate will certainly help. And then we see other things that may not necessarily be directly related to space, but are still sort of part of these programs, like a lot of like remote monitoring sort of things, this like Internet of Things or whatever, so that we don't, so you can have, some machine running somewhere, and then it's automatically updating, what's going on with the machine, and then people are able to more quickly get to issues and things like that. Even things like your water monitoring systems. Well, certainly like larger scale water monitoring as far as being able to see what's happening to water levels and then other climate events and what have you. And so it's certainly, we've still gained a lot of benefit through the space race as yeah.
Besides China and Russia, what other countries might be a threat?
Let me see. In space or just in general? In space. I guess, well, you could potentially say things like North Korea, right? Only for the fact of this rockets may enter space and then come back out. But as far as countries that are, putting up things to live in space, like satellites and what have you, it's really China and Russia that we need to be concerned about. We don't really have too much animosity amongst any other kind of spacefaring nations. Because ISIS isn't launching satellites, not yet anyways. And so, I guess that's a fear too though, right? Like as space travel becomes cheaper and becomes more available across areas, that maybe ISIS does start launching satellites. These are pros and cons you get out of everything, right? Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Do some of the European countries who benefit from the U.S. technology, do they share in do they pay the U.S. for this?
Yes, yeah. They're whether we would ever consider any of these trade-offs fair or what have you, but they generally do, at least especially pay for launch services and those sort of things. And then Europe actually ended up developing some launch services of their own. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of trade-offs that happen there. They share things with us. Sometimes it's not always money related. Sometimes it's otherwise. But there are certainly, we're not just giving it away for free, right? Yeah. And in the back there.
What are the conditions of us shooting down some of the satellites?
Probably somebody shot down one of ours. That's probably when we would actually escalate to that. As far as like the strict, ROE on that, like I didn't write it, and I certainly was not in a place to know it. None of us really would be, but I would imagine that we're probably not going to be trying to shoot down satellite until somebody first makes that move. And probably for the fact of so much of our dominance on a battlefield does come from space, so we don't want to encourage that retaliation, right?
Did China recently shoot down some satellites?
Yeah, they shot down their own. Yeah, and that's the. I mean, we can do it. We do shoot down some of our own too, right? As a show of force, basically. That hey, we can do this, and we can do it better than you can, really. Yeah, that's. I mean, it is a provocative kind of thing, right? To start shooting down satellites, even if it is your own satellite, even if it is old and not working anymore, it's still a pretty provocative type of action there. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Join us next week when we will have Robert Sturgeon from UT Tyler talking about Myanmar. So see you then.